Attachment and Separateness in the Experience of Symbiotic Relatedness by Rachel Blass and Sydney Blatt. Part 2. Attachment and Separateness Developmental Aims. Two primary developmental lines, aims. Core. Attachment equals stable relationships/relatedness. Separateness equals autonomy, independence, differentiation. Identity emerges from their dialectical interplay. Personality development throughout the life cycle involves two fundamental developmental lines, that of attachment and that of separateness, Blass and Blatt. Development in the attachment line involves the quality of the individual's relationship, the capacity to form and maintain stable relationships and to integrate them into a sense of self in relation to another. Development in the separateness line involves the individual as a self-contained and independent unit. Individuation, differentiation, and autonomy are developmental achievements that lead to a stable sense of self as separate with a clear sense of goals and values. The relationship between these two developmental lines is intimate and complex, with the individual's overall self-identity emerging as a product of the ongoing dialectic between the self as separate and the self as experienced in attachments to objects. Blatt and Blass, 1990, page 115. Revision of Erikson's model. Core. Their framework expands. Erikson explains how internalization and integration support both lines. Previously, Blass and Blatt, we defined the specific stages and effective and functional components of the two developmental lines of attachment and separateness and the relationship between them through a revision and elaboration of Erikson's 8-stage model of psychosocial development. This provided a context for the understanding of the processes of internalization and integration through which psychological development occurs. Differentiating attachment versus separateness aims. Separateness aim functional use of object, mastery, acknowledgement, self-preservation. Attachment aim intimacy, recognition of other, belonging, mutuality. Appreciation of basic aims clarifies the distinction between the attachment and separateness developmental lines, as well as the distinction between object relations theories that highlight attachment and those that highlight separateness. The aim to attain a sense of self as separate and the aim to enhance attachments determine the individual's actions, thoughts, and feelings. Relationships are necessary for development along either of the lines, and all progressive development involves the emergence of a more fully integrated self. But relationships differ according to whether they primarily serve the aim of separateness or the aim of attachment. When the separateness aim predominates, the relationship is marked by a functional use of the object in the service of the preservation or gratification of the sense of self as separate. The object is recognized insofar as it contributes to this aim. Classical psychoanalytic roots. Core. Freud's narcissism equals separateness line. Bowlby, Ballant, Benedek equals attachment line. Classical notions of narcissistic relationships, beginning with Freud 1914, clearly reflect the underlying separateness aim, as do relationships that center on partial aims of separateness, such as the attainment of mastery and personal acknowledgement. When the attachment aim predominates, however, the focus is on the experience of attachment to the object, with recognition of the existence and integrity of the other as an inherent component of that experience. This recognition of the other, while occurring at different levels of development, always entails more than awareness of self-function and gratification of self needs that the object provides. Attachment aim, innate needs for contact. Core. Attachment isn't reducible to gratification. It's about recognizing and being recognized by the other. Within these relationships, the individual expresses innate and lifelong needs for human contact, ongoing wishes to be responded to by the other, and in turn to be responsive or pleasing to the other. G. Klein, 1976, Suddy, 1935, and later transformations of such needs and wishes in the form of selfless concern, Winnicott, 1963, non-reducible needs for intimacy, mutuality, and a sense of belonging. G. Klein, 1976, page 229. Different trajectories of self-development. Similarly, self-development and integration may be conceived of differently when the predominant aim is separateness or attachment. In the separateness developmental line, self-development is an ultimate aim. In the attachment line, in contrast, self-development is a necessary byproduct in the course of a process of development toward increasingly mature relationships. Metapsychological foundations. This focus on two primary aims of development, attachment and separateness, is consistent with Freud's 1930, page 140 position that the development of the individual seems to be a product of the interaction between two urges, the urge towards happiness, which we usually call egoistic, and the urge towards union with others. The focus on these two aims also reflects our fundamental view that the individual's basic aims and motivations form the basis of any meaningful framework of psychic experience and development. The postulation of such aims on the metapsychological level gives meaning to the personal wishes, Reasons, Actions, and Feelings of Each Individual, Eagle 1980-1984.4. Experiential Consequences. Core, what the individual seeks, consciously/unconsciously, determines how symbiosis is experienced, sets up the distinction between fusion versus merger. Moreover, the specific qualitative experiences of interpersonal and intrapsychic events are determined to a large degree by the aim behind the initiation or prolongation of these events. G. Klein, 1976. For example, the experience of sexual wishes and fantasies is a function of what the individual seeks to attain, consciously and unconsciously, from the object of his/her desires. The articulation of the basic aims of the individual enables us to distinguish among several different types of symbiotic experiences. The experience of symbiosis. Defining symbiosis as undifferentiation. Core. Distinction between structural definition versus experiential states. Defined as a state of undifferentiation, symbiosis describes a structural relationship between representations. Blatt and Wild, 1976, page 85. It would be inappropriate, for example, to use the term symbiosis to refer to a dependency between two individuals who are experienced as distinct, no matter how firm the tie and mutually satisfying the relationship. Furthermore, symbiosis is appropriate only when considered an intrapsychic experience. Angel, 1967, 1972, Harrison, 1986. Like many other metapsychological terms, however, the term symbiosis may be transposed to the experiential realm and may be used to define experiential states. Meissner, 1981. The intrapsychic state of symbiosis finds expression in various forms and experiences, depending on the differential involvement of the aims of attachment and of separateness. Two categories of symbiotic experience. Core. Separateness aim fusion. Attachment aim merger. Two broad categories of experience are traditionally associated with the intrapsychic state of undifferentiation denoted by the concept of symbiosis. In one category, the experience is that of the expansion of the self to include the need-satisfying maternal part object. This is an experience of fusion whereby the lack of differentiation of self and object involves the omnipotent experience of the other as part of oneself. In the other category, the experience is that of merger. The lack of differentiation here reflects the most intimate tie between the individual and the maternal object in which the two are experienced as joined together into one. What determines the differential experience of the single structural state of undifferentiation is the kind of developmental aim that underlies that psychic state. When the state of undifferentiation is primarily formed or maintained in the service of separateness, then the experience is of fusion. And when the state of undifferentiation is primarily formed or maintained in the service of attachment, the experience is of merger. A convergence of theoretical considerations and clinical data supports this contention. By basic motives, we mean hypothetical constructs of what serves as an impetus to human activity, including cognitive and emotional activity. Basic aims can be seen as a related construct representing the desired state of the organism. Basic motives should be distinguished from clinically observable personal motives and wishes. While the former are metapsychological, the latter are experiential constructs. Freud on fusion and merger. Fusion. Primary narcissism, omnipotence, mastery, self-expansion. Merger. Myths of sexuality and union return to oneness, intimacy, dual unity. Freud's writings on love encompass both I and you are one. While symbiosis was never a focal issue for Freud, he does refer to both fusion and merger. Fusion is particularly noted in some of his comments on primary narcissism, which, as a state and stage, in many ways corresponds to symbiosis, Grunberger, Robbins, Smith. Merger is most directly addressed in some of Freud's speculations on the origin of sexuality. Additional reference is found in his discussions of love, which, in effect, join together the two other contexts of fusion and merger. It has been claimed by some theorists, e.g. Harrison, 1986, that primary narcissism in Freud's writings refers to an objectless state and therefore cannot be considered in terms of the relational concept of symbiosis. Careful reading of Freud, especially after 1923 Smith, 1985, reveals, however, that the state of objectlessness associated with primary narcissism is derived in part from the extension of the self to include the object within its boundaries. 5 Such an understanding of Freud is reflected in discussions of primary narcissistic union, Grunberger, 1971, Lowald, 1960, and of an initial oneness resulting from the blurring of boundaries between mother and child, Andreas Salome, 1921, Rose, 1972. Implicit here is the paradoxical idea that a primary state of undifferentiation results from the manipulation of already existent differentiating boundaries. This paradox is repeated in many of the attempts to formulate the experience of the infant during primary narcissism, e.g. Jacobson, 1964. Freud's position is clearly presented through his introduction of the idea of an all-embracing feeling based on an original bond with the objects in the infant's environment. In a discussion of Romain Rolland's description of an oceanic feeling, Freud, 1930, states, "Originally the ego includes everything, later it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is, therefore, only a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed, and all-embracing feeling which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. If we may assume that there are many people in whose mental life this primary ego feeling has persisted to a greater or lesser degree, it would exist in them side by side with the narrower and more sharply demarcated ego feeling of maturity, like a kind of counterpart to it. In that case, the ideational contents appropriate to it would be precisely those of limitlessness and of a bond with the universe." Page 68. Here Freud speaks of the experiences of fusion. The world is experienced as part of the ego. This experience is associated with a sense of omnipotence, of self, love, and self-contentment. Freud. It is clear that the aim underlying these experiences is that of separateness. What the individual attains through the primary narcissistic state and its reestablishment at later points in life is a sense of perfection, Freud, increase of self-regard, Freud, control of the maternal part object, Freud, or mastery of the needs which that object supplies. Freud's speculations about the origin of sexuality point to his awareness of aims and experiences other than separateness and fusion that are associated with the state of undifferentiation. In presenting these ideas, Freud takes recourse to mythology, pointing to the absence of a theoretical framework. Quoting Plato, Freud tells of the Greek legend of there having originally been three sexes, man, woman, and the union of the two, and how Zeus decided to cut the last of these in two. After the division had been made, the two parts of man, each desiring his other half, came together, and threw their arms about one another eager to grow into one. Freud, 1920. Freud adds a Upanishadic myth with a similar theme. In that myth, the origin of the world is described as a result of the Atman, the self or ego, splitting himself into two, into husband and wife. Thus, a painful void was filled with each of the two becoming to each other like half a shell. Page 58. N. Through these accounts, Freud suggests that the ultimate source and aim of sexuality is the need to restore to an earlier state of things, an original oneness that had existed between two. Thus, the experience of undifferentiation is here associated with an attachment aim, that is, the experience of merger. The experience is not of self-expansion but of joining or rejoining. It is an elusive experience of a dual unity, requiring two complementary myths for its description. One myth emphasizes the desire for undifferentiation, and the other emphasizes the necessity for some differentiation. Some division is required for its elimination to be experienced as a filling of a void, ibid. Both narcissistic fusion and the attachment experience of merger are encompassed within Freud's descriptions of the experience of the individual in love who, against all the evidence of his senses, declares that I and you are one, and is prepared to behave as if it were a fact. Freud, 1930, page 66. What, on a structural level, is a melting away of the boundary between ego and object, ibid, on an experiential level may be either an expression of self-love in relationship with a narcissistic love object, Freud, 1914, or an expression of an intimate attachment to an other who through love becomes merged with oneself. The former involves the aim of separateness and the latter the aim of attachment. See Bergman, 1988, on Freud's three theories of love. Theoretical divergence in later writers. Core, undifferentiation described differently depending on the assumed motive/aim. In more recent years, theorists who discuss the psychic state of undifferentiation can be divided into those who consider it an experience of fusion and those who consider it an experience of merger. Implicit differential assumptions concerning the motives and needs underlying undifferentiation correspond to the kinds of experiences described by these two groups of theorists. Study of the recent discussions of undifferentiation in light of underlying motivational factors allows for a more refined awareness of the variety of experiences encompassed by symbiotic relatedness. In the experience of fusion, two basic forms of self-expansion become apparent. The expansion of the self's power and control, and two, the expansion of the self-representation. The expansion of the limits of power and control refers to the less extreme form of fusion. Expansion of power and control. The other is experienced as an extension of the self and of its agency. Schaeffer, 1968, and thus is subject to the control of the self's personal wishes and desires. The object becomes one with the self in the sense that it is experienced as belonging to the self, as a limb belongs to the body. Depending on the phase of libidinal development, the object may be experienced as a mouth or a breast, an anal product or a phallic extension. Rose, 1966. Winnicott's discussion of the infant's omnipotent fantasy of the control of the mother's breast exemplifies this form of expansion. In experiencing mother first as a subjective object, and then later as transitional object, 1953, infants maintain the illusion of the power to create the breast through their need for it. Some of Winnicott's followers continue to emphasize this kind of fusion. Modell, for example, writes, "The creative illusion that denies the sense of separateness between the self and the object is an illusion of action at a distance." In terms of aims, illusions of this kind create a sense of mastery, control, and omnipotence. See also Rose, 1971, and thus are conducive to the development of a sense of self as separate. In contrast to this experience of an expansion of power and control, the experience of fusion can also be associated with an expansion of the self-representation. 2. Expansion of the self-representation. Here the individual experiences the self and the other as one and the same. This form of fusion is often described in terms of oral incorporative fantasies, the wish to devour the object and thus to become one with it. Angel, Jacobson. Among those who emphasize this form of fusion are many ego psychologists, e.g. Blatt and Wild, Giovacchini, Jacobson, Schaefer, Silverman. Schaefer, for example, describes an experience in which the subject feels as if there were only one person, not two. He goes on to affirm that incorporative wishes and fantasies are also involved in it, the hypothetical prototype being the infant's fusion of rudimentary self and object images in the nursing situation. He continues, "It is undifferentiated unity that is experienced or sought, rather than the relation of one person to another, ibid." This form of fusion also emerges, in more Kleinian terms, in discussions of the process of projective identification. Most notable in this regard is Grotstein's, 1981, analysis of fusional oneness and blurring of the distinctions between the self and object, page 128, obtained through that process. The undifferentiated unity or fusional oneness, as in the case of the expansion of the self form of fusion, expresses primarily underlying separateness aims. Control, autonomy, and mastery, Giovacchini, Grotstein, as well as the omnipotence of the expansion of the self, Grunberger, Jacobson, and the rectification of its ego functions, Burnham, et al. Jacobson, are among the major partial aims underlying and maintaining this form of loss of self-object boundaries. As Silverman et al. 1982 concluded in their analysis of the various psychological needs satisfied by the symbiotic experience, there is no contradiction between wanting oneness and wanting separateness. Oneness gratifications, in a process largely unknown to us, actually deepen the sense of self. p. 129. The difference between the two forms of fusion, the experience of the expansion of power and control and that of the expansion of the self-representation, was recognized by Freud in a brief note on forms of identification in the object relations of children. He distinguished between having and being. The latter experience is, I am the breast, and the former is, I have it. Freud, 1941. In fusion, individuals may be active or passive, either experiencing their control extended to the other or experiencing the control of the other extended to themselves. Kahn, 1969. Rose, 1966. They may experience themselves as devouring the object or as being devoured by it. Angel, 1972. Involvement of aggressive drives, defense, Angel, 1967, and the need for security from an omnipotent figure, Modell, 1968, are some of the factors that determine whether active or passive modes of fusion will emerge. The separateness aim not only defines a specific category of experience of the intrapsychic state of self-object differentiation fusion, but it also gives it a unique experiential flavor. Here, the intrapsychic relatedness to the object is only a means to the consolidation and gratification of the self as separate, and this is reflected in the nature of the experience. The experience of the other as an extension or as one with the self and vice versa is paradoxically characterized by an elimination of the object and of the sense of relatedness to it. What is sought is an experience of the self as a monad, or in the passive form of the object alone. What is lacking is the experience of true attachment, Blass and Blatt, 1992, to the object. The sense of true attachment, however, is found in the symbiotic experience of merger, which is considerably less variegated than that of fusion. This experience always has at its foundation, even if in primitive form, the sense of intimacy that may be tied to the idea of we are one. The understanding of the experience of merger and its underlying aim of attachment has been notably furthered by the Hungarian school of psychoanalysis beginning with Ferenczi, 1913. M. Balance, 1952, concept of primary object love, and Hermans, 1936, concept of dual Einheit, contain important attempts to conceptualize that experience. Lichtenstein has elaborated the experience of merger, drawing heavily on these earlier works. Countering the argument that a loving attachment to the object requires clear differentiation from it, Lichtenstein, 1961, highlights both the primary form of attachment to the object and the undifferentiation found in the earliest stages of development which, in his view, continue to some degree throughout the life cycle. The infant is one with the mother, but simultaneously, there is a primary relatedness. Page 72. David, 1980, and Pash, 1965, have also attested to a unique experience of undifferentiation that is desired for the sense of attachment that it provides. Speaking of the reasons for wishing to merge with the maternal part object, David explains that there is a wish to return to the lost paradise of sucking at the breast that goes beyond simply fulfilling the goals of sexual and narcissistic satisfactions alone. Pash adds that this wish for the experience of merger could be explained in no other way than by the fact that the natural unit is not simply I or the ego as subject, but I with the other. Merger experiences are also discussed in the works of theorists, e.g. Jacobson, Kohut, Mahler, who have emphasized separateness. While their theoretical bias toward separateness ultimately restricts their understanding of the state of merger to an overall separateness aim, thus equating merger and fusion, descriptively they provide illustrations of merger and implicitly introduce attachment aims as factors motivating this kind of undifferentiation. While merger is a more unitary category of experience than fusion, here, too, variations occur according to the active-passive dimension. The wish to reunite may be felt either actively as a wish to draw the other to oneself, or passively as a feeling of being drawn to the other. Within the reunion itself, however, distinctions of this kind are ultimately lost. As in the case of fusion, it is the underlying aim, here that of attachment, that provides the framework for understanding the various forms of this experience. Thus far, we have elucidated the concept of symbiosis as a variety of experiences of relatedness determined by and reflective of the different forms of basic needs and aims underlying the intrapsychic structural state of undifferentiation. These symbiotic experiences tell us not only of the hypothetical structural state of undifferentiated representations but also of the various motives underlying the experience of this state. The relevance of the concept of symbiosis is further highlighted by applying it to the process of development with awareness of its different dimensions, i.e., the dimensions of experience, forms of fusion and merger, structure, undifferentiation, and underlying basic aims, separateness and attachment. It was in the developmental context of infant research as well as in work on psychopathologies that the challenges to symbiosis emerged. It was contended that notions of symbiosis contradict evidence regarding the neonate's and infant's degree of differentiation. It was further contended that since symbiotic states may be found in various pathological groups, as well as in individuals with a well-integrated identity, the meaning of symbiosis and undifferentiated representations of self and other is no longer clear. Applying our conceptualization of symbiosis as fusion or merger to the developmental context enables us to respond to these contemporary challenges.